The dish was still warm when he set it back down on the table without eating it. He did not look at me. He only said one sentence, quiet, almost polite, the way a man asks for salt. And then he waited. It was 10 minutes before midnight on Christmas Eve, and the house smelled like cloves and wood smoke, and I remember thinking that whatever was about to happen, I would remember the smell of it for the rest of my life. Whatever you are picturing right now, it is not what actually happened. This is not the kind of Christmas story you think it is. There were no raised voices. There was no broken glass. There was only a sentence, and a lamp, and a woman learning that a house can go cold without anyone touching the fire. Stay with me, because to understand that sentence, you have to understand the 7 Christmas Eves that came before it. My name is Margaret, and I grew up in a strict old order Amish settlement in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I left when I was 29, and now I tell the stories we were taught to swallow. If you grew up in a world where silence was called obedience, and obedience was called love, tell me in the comments. Tell me one sentence you were never allowed to finish. I read every single one, because those unfinished sentences are the whole reason I started this channel. Subscribe if you want to hear the rest of what the plain world doesn't say out loud. To understand the sentence my husband said that night, you have to understand what a plain woman is raised to be. In our settlement, the ordnung was the shape of everything. It was the unwritten mind of the church, spoken through the bishop, enforced through the deacons, and carried in the mouths of older women who had learned it in their own bodies long before they ever taught it to us. The ordnung told us the width of a bonnet string. It told us the color of a dress, the height of a buggy step, the shape of a prayer, the hour of a meal. But the loudest rules were the ones no one ever wrote down. A plain woman is taught to be useful before she is taught to be a person. By 9, I could bake bread that would not fall. By 12, I could quiet a colicky baby that wasn't mine. By 15, I knew how to enter a room without making the floorboards notice me. My mother used to say, "A good wife is a warm house." She meant it kindly. She meant that our whole worth was measured by whether the men who came in from the barn felt taken care of. Whether the coffee was hot. Whether the children were washed. Whether the wife was quiet. We were taught that submission was a form of devotion. That a husband was the head, and the head did not need to explain itself. When we married, we did not vow to love. We vowed to obey. And in our community, obey was a very wide word. It covered what you cooked and what you wore and what you said and what you did not say. It covered the bedroom lamp, and the barn door, and the church bench, and every hour in between. I married Amos when I was 19. He was 23, the second son of a respected family, quiet in the way men were praised for being quiet. My mother cried at the wedding, and I thought it was joy. Later, I understood it was something older than joy. It was the sound a woman makes when she watches another woman step into the same room she once stepped into and cannot warn her, because warning is not allowed, only hinting. Amish women hint. That is how we survive. We say, "He is a hard worker," when we mean, he does not stop. We say, "She keeps a clean house," when we mean, she is afraid to sit down. We say, "It is the way of things," when we mean, there is no door. My Aunt Lydia once told me, 3 days before my wedding, "Margaret, a wife has no ceiling and no floor." I nodded like I understood. I did not understand for 7 more years. The first Christmas Eve after we married, Amos came in from the barn late. The snow was thick, and his beard had ice in it. I had made everything the way his mother did, because that was the measure. Bread, ham, apple butter, the pie with the lattice top. He ate. Without speaking, which I had already learned was not anger, only habit. Then he said, "Come upstairs." And I did. Because a wife does. Because the vows said obey, and the ordnung said obey, and my mother's face at the wedding said obey. I want to be careful here, because this is not a story about one bad man. Amos was, in his own way, a product of the same system that made me. He had been raised to believe a wife's body belonged to the household the way the stove did, the way the buggy did. Not out of cruelty. Out of order. That is the word they used. Order. Everything in its place. Everything owed. Everything expected. By the third Christmas, I had 2 babies and a back that did not straighten all the way anymore. By the 5th, I had learned that there were nights I could not say I was tired, because tired was not a reason a wife was allowed to give. My body learned to speak before my mouth had permission. It would go still. It would go far away. It would come back in the morning to knead the bread. The older women knew. That is the part outsiders do not understand. They knew, and they did not tell us, because they had not been told either. Instead, they passed us small mercies. An extra jar of preserves. A quilted blanket folded onto the porch. A hand on the shoulder at the wash line. You are a good wife, Margaret. That was the sentence. That was the whole warning and the whole prison in one breath. The 7th Christmas Eve, I was 26. The children were asleep upstairs under the quilt my grandmother had stitched. The kerosene lamp on the kitchen table was low, the wick trimmed the way Amos liked it. I had made the meal. I had washed the dishes. I had swept the floor twice, because sweeping was the closest thing to prayer I had left. He came in from the barn. He sat down. He picked up the dish. He set it back down without eating. And then he said the sentence. I am not going to give you the exact words, because the exact words are not the point, and because some sentences were built to be repeated and some were built to be broken. What matters is what the sentence meant. It meant that Christmas Eve had a rule I had not been told. It meant that before the midnight service, before the candles, before the hymn, there was something a husband was allowed to ask for, and something a wife was expected to give, and no one had ever said it out loud because saying it out loud would have made it a choice. And a choice was the one thing the ordnung could not survive. I remember looking at the lamp. I remember the small blue center of the flame. I remember thinking, very clearly, for the first time in my whole life, no. Not out loud. Just the shape of it, sitting in my chest like a stone I had been carrying without knowing. I did not say no that night. I want to be honest with you. I did what a plain wife does. I stood up. I followed. I went far away inside myself, the way I had learned. But something in me stayed in the kitchen. Something in me stayed with the lamp. And in the morning, when I came down to start the fire, that part of me was still sitting at the table, waiting. It took 3 more years. I want you to know that, because leaving is not a moment. Leaving is a slow understanding. I started noticing things I had trained myself not to notice. The way my daughter flinched when a man raised his voice, even kindly. The way my own mother's hands shook when she poured coffee. The way the bishop's wife smiled with only the bottom half of her face. I started to see the system. Not the people. The system. The unwritten rules stacked on top of each other like stones on a chest, until a woman could not breathe deep enough to say her own name. Here is the realization that broke me open, and I will say it plainly. The ordnung told us what to wear and what to cook and how to pray. But the loudest rules, the ones that decided whether a wife could be tired, whether a wife could be sick, whether a wife could say no on Christmas Eve 10 minutes before midnight, those rules were never written down. Because if they had been written down, someone might have read them and said, "This is not from God. This is from men." And the whole warm house would have gone cold. When I finally left, I took the 2 youngest with me. The older one stayed. That is a grief I do not have language for yet, and I will not pretend I do. I walked out on a Tuesday in April, with a bag of clothes and a jar of my grandmother's apple butter, and I did not look back at the barn, because if I had looked back at the barn I would have gone back inside. The first therapist I saw, a soft woman with gray hair and a warm office, asked me a question I had never heard before. She asked, "Margaret, what did you want?" Not what was expected. Not what was owed. Not what was ordered. What did you want? I cried for 40 minutes. I could not answer. I did not know the shape of that word yet. Want. It was a foreign country, and I did not have the passport. I have the passport now. It took years. It took a small apartment with a lock on the door that only I had the key to. It took learning that a no is a whole sentence, and does not need a because after it. It took learning that a body is not a stove and not a buggy and not a warm house. A body is a person. A person is not owed. If you are watching this from inside a life that looks warm from the outside and feels cold from the inside, I want you to hear me. The silence around you is not holy. It is just silence. The rules you cannot find in any book are still rules, and they are still costing you something, and you are allowed to count that cost. You are allowed to sit at your own kitchen table and say the word no, even if it is only to the lamp. Even if it is only to yourself. Say it once, and it will be easier the second time. I still light a kerosene lamp on Christmas Eve. I do it in my own kitchen now, in a house Amos has never seen, with a door only I have the key to. I trim the wick the way I was taught, because some things I keep, and some things I do not. I sit at the table. I do not make the meal I used to make. I make something new. And when the small blue center of the flame steadies, I say the sentence I did not say that night, out loud, to no one but the light. No. That is the whole sentence. It always was.